The carriage door slammed shut before Clara Whitfield could even settle her skirts, and the driver was already shouting at the horses to move. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and looked back at the tall stone house glowing with candlelight, and her chest ached so badly she thought she might be sick. Just an hour ago she had been sitting at that long dinner table, trying to remember which fork to use, trying not to shake under the stares of a dozen wealthy strangers. Now she was being sent away in the dark, dismissed, like a servant caught stealing silver, though she had done nothing wrong, except exist in a room where she was not wanted. She should have known this day would come. She had known it from the very first morning she arrived at Ashford Hall 3 months ago, soaked from the rain, clutching a single worn bag and a letter of introduction that trembled in her cold fingers. Back then, the housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Fenwick, had looked her up and down at the servants' entrance and sniffed, as though Clara smelled of something unpleasant. "You're the new companion for Miss Lily," Mrs. Fenwick had said, not as a question. "God help you." Clara had swallowed her nerves and nodded. She needed this position. Her father's debts had swallowed everything her family owned, and this small, quiet role, caring for a motherless 6-year-old girl in a great house far from anywhere Clara knew, was the only door left open to her. She had not expected the child to be so silent. Lily Ashford had dark curls and enormous gray eyes, the same gray as her father's, and when Clara first knelt in front of her in the nursery, the little girl had simply stared, unblinking, as if Clara were a piece of furniture that had wandered into the wrong room. "Hello, Lily," Clara had said softly. "My name is Clara. I've come to keep you company." No answer, not even a flicker. The nursemaid who had been minding Lily gathered her things quickly, eager to be free of the job. "She doesn't talk much," the woman muttered on her way out. "Not since her mother passed. Best of luck to you." And then Clara was alone, with a silent child in a silent room, in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. That first week had nearly broken her. Lily would not eat unless food was placed directly in front of her without a word. She would not play. She would sit by the window for hours, watching the garden, as though waiting for someone who was never going to come back. The Duke, Edmund Ashford, was worse than a stranger. He was a shadow that passed through the halls of his own house, rarely speaking to anyone, least of all the new companion his aunt had insisted on hiring. Clara saw him perhaps twice in her first 2 weeks, always at a distance, always dressed in dark clothes, always with that same cold, closed expression, as if his face had frozen the day his wife died, and never learned how to move again. She had heard the servants whisper about him in the kitchen, when they thought no one was listening. He had loved his wife deeply, they said. Too deeply, perhaps, because when she died bringing Lily into the world, something in him had died along with her. He had thrown himself into managing his lands and his money, and he had left his daughter to be raised by nursemaids and governesses who came and went like the seasons, none of them lasting long, none of them able to reach the little girl who had inherited both her mother's absence and her father's silence. Clara had almost given up during her second week. She remembered sitting on the floor of the nursery late one evening, exhausted, wondering if she should simply pack her bag and go home to face her family's debts, rather than spend one more day failing to reach a child who refused to be reached. That was the night she found the small wooden horse. It was tucked behind a stack of books on a high shelf, dusty and forgotten, its paint chipped along one flank. When Clara pulled it down and looked at it, she noticed something carved into its underside, tiny letters scratched by a careful hand. "For my darling Lily, from Mama." Clara's throat had tightened. She carried the horse to where Lily sat by the window and set it gently in the girl's lap, saying nothing. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Lily's small fingers closed around the toy, and for the first time since Clara had arrived, the girl's eyes filled with tears that actually fell, rolling down her cheeks in silence, her shoulders shaking with a grief too large for such a small body. Clara had not tried to stop the crying. She had simply sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and let the girl cry until she had nothing left. And then Lily had leaned her head against Clara's arm and fallen asleep right there on the window seat. That night marked the beginning of something Clara had not expected to find in that cold house, a fragile thread of trust between herself and a grieving child. Over the following weeks, that thread grew stronger. Lily began to speak again, first in whispers, then in full sentences, then in the bright chatter of a normal little girl who had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to wait with her. She asked Clara to read to her every night. She showed Clara her secret hiding spots in the garden. She began to laugh, a small surprised sound at first, as though she had forgotten she was allowed to make it. The change did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Fenwick softened toward Clara, if only slightly. The other servants began greeting her by name instead of simply nodding. And once, just once, Clara had caught the Duke standing in the hallway outside the nursery door, watching through the gap where it stood ajar, his face unreadable as he listened to his daughter's laughter drifting out into the corridor. He had not said a word to Clara. He had simply turned and walked away, his boots silent on the thick carpet, but something in the way he had lingered there stayed with her long after he was gone. She told herself it meant nothing. He was a duke, and she was a paid companion with no fortune and no family name worth mentioning. Whatever softness had crossed his face in that hallway was for his daughter, not for her. And yet, in the weeks that followed, she began to notice small things. He started taking his breakfast at the same time Clara brought Lily down to the small family dining room, though he had always eaten alone before. He asked, once, in a voice so careful it seemed to cost him something, whether Lily had been sleeping well. He left a book on the nursery table one evening, a collection of old fairy tales, without any note or explanation, and Clara understood without being told that it was meant for Lily, and that he had chosen it himself. She should have been more careful. She should have remembered her place. But it was difficult to remember such things when she watched a broken little girl slowly become whole again, and even more difficult when she caught the Duke's gray eyes, so like his daughter's, resting on her from across a room, with an expression she could not quite name, something that looked almost like hope trying to survive against its own will. Now, sitting in the dark carriage, rattling away from Ashford Hall, Clara pressed her fingers to her lips and tried to hold back the sob building in her chest. She thought of the dinner she had just fled, of Lady Margaret's sharp voice cutting through the room like a blade, of the Duke's face going pale and hard as his aunt spoke, of the terrible moment when he had turned to Clara and told her, in front of every guest at that table, that she was no longer needed at Ashford Hall. She had not even been given a chance to say goodbye to Lily. The thought made her chest cave in on itself. Somewhere behind her, back in that great stone house, a little girl was sleeping peacefully, trusting that when she woke in the morning, Clara would be there to braid her hair and read her a story before breakfast, just as she always was. Clara did not know how she would explain her absence. She did not know if anyone would even try. The carriage rounded a bend in the road, and Ashford Hall disappeared behind a line of dark trees. Clara closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely now that there was no one left to see them, and she wondered whether she would ever again hear that small, precious sound of Lily's laughter drifting down a quiet hallway. She did not know, in that moment, that behind her, in a nursery window high above the drive, a small face had already pressed itself against the cold glass, watching the carriage lights shrink into the darkness, and that within minutes, the whole house would wake to the sound of a child screaming for someone she refused to lose. 3 weeks before that terrible night at dinner, Clara had no idea her happiness was already numbered. She woke each morning now to the sound of small feet running down the corridor toward her room, and she had grown so used to this that she kept her door slightly open, just enough for Lily to slip inside and climb onto the edge of her bed before the sun had fully risen. "Clara, wake up. Wake up. It's a good morning today," Lily would announce, as though she had personally checked and approved the weather. Clara would laugh and pull the girl into a hug, and for a moment, the whole cold, quiet house would feel warm. It amazed her, still, how much had changed in so short a time. The silent, staring child who had once refused to eat unless food was set before her without a word, was now a chattering, curious little girl who asked 100 questions a day and wanted to know everything about everything. Why did birds not fall out of the sky? Why did the moon follow the carriage when they rode into the village? Why had her mother gone away and not come back? And would Clara ever go away too? That last question had come on a rainy afternoon, out of nowhere, while they sat together sorting through a box of old ribbons. Clara had felt her heart stop for a moment. "I'm not going anywhere," she had said, gently, taking Lily's small hand in hers. "I promise you that." She had meant it with her whole heart. She had not known then how little control she truly had over such promises. The household had changed too, in ways Clara had not expected. Mrs. Fenwick, once cold and suspicious, now saved the best cuts of meat for Lily's tray, without being asked, and occasionally slipped Clara a kind word about how much brighter the house felt these days. The younger maids had taken to humming while they worked, something they had not done in the 2 years since the late Duchess had passed. Even old Simmons, the butler, who moved through the halls like a ghost of formality, had been seen smiling faintly when Lily's laughter rang out from the garden. And then there was the Duke. Edmund Ashford remained a difficult man to understand, but Clara had begun to notice a pattern in his silences, the way a person learns to read weather by watching clouds rather than waiting for rain. He was not cold, she had come to realize. He was afraid of a house full of feeling, because feeling had once cost him everything he loved. He had started joining them for the evening story hour, standing in the nursery doorway at first, arms crossed, saying nothing, as though he did not trust himself to come further inside. Clara would read aloud from whatever book Lily had chosen that night, her voice soft in the lamplight, and she would feel his eyes on her, more often than she felt them on the pages. One evening, Lily had patted the space beside her on the small settee and looked up at her father with a boldness that made Clara's breath catch. "Papa, sit," Lily had said simply, as though it were the easiest thing in the world. And to Clara's astonishment, he had. He had crossed the room and lowered himself onto the settee beside his daughter, stiff and unfamiliar with the posture of comfort, and Clara had continued reading as though nothing extraordinary was happening, though her heart had been pounding the entire time. After that night, he came more often. He never stayed for the whole story, and he rarely spoke, but he came, and Lily began saving her favorite parts of each day to tell him at supper, running through her adventures with a breathless excitement that made even his guarded face soften. Clara told herself she was imagining the way his gaze lingered on her sometimes, the way his voice changed slightly when he addressed her directly, growing less clipped, less formal. She told herself that a duke did not look at a governess the way she sometimes thought he looked at her, and that she was a foolish woman for even allowing the thought to cross her mind. But then came the afternoon in the garden. It had been a warm day, unusually warm for the season, and Clara had taken Lily outside to practice her letters, using a stick in the soft earth beneath the old oak tree. Lily had grown bored quickly and run off to chase a butterfly, leaving Clara alone on the garden bench with the forgotten lesson book in her lap. She had not heard the Duke approach until his shadow fell across the page. "You've done something no one else managed," he said, without preamble, his eyes fixed not on her, but on his daughter's small figure darting between the rose bushes in the distance. Clara had risen quickly, smoothing her skirts. She only needed someone to be patient with her, Your Grace. She was never as lost as everyone believed. "I believed it," he said quietly. "I believed she was lost. I believed we both were." The honesty in his voice had startled her. She did not know how to answer a duke who spoke to her as though she were simply another person, rather than someone far beneath him. "Grief takes its own time," she said carefully. "It cannot be rushed, only walked through, a little at a time." He had looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that made her feel suddenly, uncomfortably visible. "You speak as though you know this from experience." "I lost my mother when I was young," Clara admitted, "and my father's fortune not long after. I have had a fair amount of practice with loss, Your Grace." Something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like respect, or perhaps recognition, as if he had found, unexpectedly, someone who understood the particular weight he carried. "Edmund," he said suddenly. Clara blinked. "Your Grace?" "My name. When we are not in company, you may call me Edmund." He seemed almost surprised by his own offer, as though the words had escaped before he could stop them. Clara had not known what to say, so she said nothing, and after a long moment, he had cleared his throat, straightened his coat, and walked back toward the house without another word, leaving her standing beneath the oak tree, with her heart beating far too quickly for a simple garden conversation. She did not call him Edmund, not out loud, but the offer sat with her for days afterward, a small, warm secret she turned over in her mind at odd moments, while braiding Lily's hair, while walking the halls at night, while lying awake long after the house had gone quiet. She should have recognized the danger in it. A duke's easy familiarity with a paid companion was not a kindness without cost. It was the sort of thing that, if noticed by the wrong eyes, could unravel everything Clara had built in this house. Her position, her purpose, and the fragile, precious bond she had formed with a little girl who had finally learned to laugh again. But Clara was not thinking of danger in those weeks. She was thinking of the way Lily's whole face lit up each morning when she opened her eyes and saw Clara there. She was thinking of the way the house had filled with warmth that had not existed before her arrival. She was thinking, though she would not admit it fully even to herself, of the way Edmund Ashford's guarded gray eyes had begun to soften whenever they landed on her. It was Lady Margaret's letter, arriving on a gray Tuesday morning, that finally shattered the fragile peace Clara had come to think of as permanent. Clara did not see the letter itself. She only saw its effects. The way Mrs. Fenwick's face tightened when she carried the post upstairs. The way the Duke's study door remained closed for the entire afternoon. The way Simmons moved through the halls with an unusual briskness, as though bracing the household for a storm. That evening, at story time, the Duke did not come to the nursery. Lily asked for him twice, her small face falling with disappointment each time Clara gently explained that Papa was occupied with important matters. It was the first evening in weeks that he had missed, and though Clara told herself it meant nothing, a small cold feeling had settled in her stomach, the kind of feeling that comes before bad weather, long before the first drop of rain actually falls. She did not yet know that Lady Margaret had written to announce her arrival within the week, along with a guest list for a formal dinner, meant to introduce the Duke to a young woman of impeccable birth, and even more impeccable fortune. A woman Lady Margaret had already decided would make a far more suitable duchess than any governess ever could. Clara did not yet know that the warm, fragile world she had built inside Ashford Hall was about to be tested in ways she could not have imagined, or that within days, she would be standing at a dinner table listening to the man who had once offered her his given name, coldly telling her, in front of every guest present, that she no longer belonged in his house. For now, she only knew that the nursery felt a little colder that night, and that somewhere beyond its walls, a storm was gathering that would soon change everything. Lady Margaret arrived at Ashford Hall on a cold Friday afternoon in a carriage far too grand for the narrow country road, and within an hour of stepping through the front doors, she had rearranged the household to suit her own vision of how a ducal estate ought to be run. Clara felt the change immediately. Where before the halls had rung with Lily's laughter and the soft murmur of story hour, now they echoed with Lady Margaret's sharp instructions to the staff, her critical eye finding fault with everything, from the arrangement of flowers in the hall to the color of the drapes in the good parlor. "You must be the companion," Lady Margaret said, the first time she encountered Clara in the corridor, her gaze sweeping over Clara's plain dress with an expression that made Clara feel very small indeed. "Edmund mentioned you had done something with the child. Well, we shall see how long that lasts." Clara had curtsied and said nothing, though the words stung more than she wanted to admit. Over the following days, Lady Margaret's true purpose became clear. She had not come merely to visit. She had come to orchestrate a match, and the young woman she had chosen for her nephew arrived 2 days later in a flurry of trunks and maids, a Miss Eleanor Whitby, pretty and polished, the daughter of an earl with connections that would strengthen the Ashford name considerably. Clara watched from a distance as Miss Whitby was introduced to the household, as she toured the gardens on the Duke's arm, as she sat beside him at dinner each evening, while Lady Margaret beamed approvingly from across the table. Clara told herself, firmly, that this was exactly as it should be. The Duke needed a wife of proper standing. Lily needed a mother who could give her the kind of life a companion's daughter never could offer. Clara was a servant in this house, nothing more, and she had been foolish to ever imagine otherwise. But Lily did not share Clara's careful resignation. The little girl had taken an instant and vocal dislike to Miss Whitby, who showed no particular interest in children, and seemed faintly annoyed whenever Lily appeared underfoot. Where Clara had spent months coaxing Lily out of her silence, Miss Whitby's cool indifference threatened to send the girl retreating right back into it. "She doesn't like me," Lily whispered to Clara one night, her small face troubled. "And Papa doesn't look at her the way he looks at you." Clara's heart had lodged itself painfully in her throat. "Hush now, sweetheart. That's not something we should say aloud." "But it's true," Lily insisted, with the blunt honesty only a child possesses. "I've seen it. Everyone has seen it. Even Mrs. Fenwick says so in the kitchen." Clara had not known how to respond to that, and she had gone to bed that night with her mind racing, torn between hope she was terrified to name and the certain knowledge that hope, in her position, was a luxury she could not afford. The formal dinner, when it finally arrived, was meant to be the grand announcement, a public declaration, before assembled guests, of the understanding developing between the Duke and Miss Whitby. Lady Margaret had spared no expense. The dining hall glittered with candlelight and polished silver, and a dozen guests from neighboring estates had been invited to witness what everyone but Clara seemed to already consider a settled matter. Clara had not been meant to attend at all. Her place, as governess and companion, was properly in the nursery with Lily. But Lily had thrown such a determined fit at being separated from Clara on this particular evening, refusing to be calmed by anyone else, that the Duke himself had finally relented and asked that Clara join them at the table, seated near the far end among the less distinguished guests, simply to keep his daughter settled enough to sit through the meal. It had been, Clara realized too late, a terrible mistake. She had felt out of place from the moment she sat down, painfully aware of her plain dress among the guests' fine silks, painfully aware of Lady Margaret's cold glances traveling down the table toward her throughout the first course. Lily sat beside her, unusually quiet, picking at her food, and watching her father with an expression far too serious for a child her age. The conversation moved through polite topics, the weather, the state of the roads, a recent horse race 2 counties over, until Lady Margaret, with the practiced skill of a woman who enjoyed steering conversations exactly where she wished them to go, turned the subject toward the future of Ashford Hall. "It does my heart good," she announced to the table at large, "to see this house finally settling into its proper order again. For too long it has drifted without a steady hand, but I think we can all see the shape of things to come." She smiled meaningfully at Miss Whitby, who lowered her eyes with practiced modesty. Several guests murmured their approval. Clara kept her own eyes fixed on her plate, her appetite gone entirely. "Of course," Lady Margaret continued, and here her gaze slid deliberately down the table toward Clara. "A house cannot find its proper order while certain irregularities remain unaddressed." The table quieted. Clara felt her face grow hot. "I speak plainly because I care for this family," Lady Margaret went on, her voice sweet as poison. "But surely everyone here can see how inappropriate it is for a young unmarried woman of no particular standing to have grown so very close to a widowed duke and his impressionable young daughter. People do talk, Edmund. Even out here in the country, people talk." Clara's hands, resting in her lap, had gone cold as ice. Beside her, Lily had stopped eating entirely, her small face turning between Clara and her father with dawning alarm. The Duke's jaw had tightened, a muscle flickering beneath his skin, but he said nothing, and his silence felt to Clara like the loudest sound in the room. "I only mean to protect the family name," Lady Margaret pressed on, sensing her advantage. "A Duke's household must be beyond reproach. Miss Whitby understands this. I am certain Miss Whitfield understands it too." She turned her cold smile fully on Clara now. "You do understand, don't you, my dear? How it looks?" Every eye at the table had turned to Clara. She felt as though the floor had opened beneath her chair, as though she were falling, and everyone was simply watching her fall. "I have only ever tried to care for Lily," Clara managed, her voice unsteady but proud. "Nothing more." Of course," Lady Margaret said, in a tone that suggested the exact opposite. "But intentions matter so little compared to appearances, don't they? And the appearance, my dear, is rather difficult to ignore." Clara looked, helplessly, toward the head of the table, toward the man who had once offered her his given name beneath an old oak tree, who had sat beside his daughter on a small settee and let a servant read him fairy tales, who had told her that grief could only be walked through and never rushed. She looked for some sign that he would defend her, that he would say something, anything, to end his aunt's cruel performance. He looked back at her, and for one terrible moment, Clara saw something flicker across his face. Regret, perhaps, or fear, or the particular helplessness of a man who has spent his whole life avoiding conflict, rather than facing it. And then he looked away, down at his own plate, his shoulders squared in the careful posture of a man retreating behind his title. "Perhaps," he said finally, his voice flat and formal in a way Clara had not heard from him in weeks, "it would be best if Miss Whitfield did not join us for further evening engagements of this nature." The words landed like a physical blow. Clara felt her breath leave her body all at once. "Papa," Lily said, her small voice cutting through the sudden silence, confused and frightened. "Papa, what does that mean?" The Duke did not answer his daughter. He kept his eyes fixed on his plate, and Lady Margaret, satisfied, moved smoothly on to another topic, the conversation resuming around Clara, as though nothing at all had happened, as though a woman's entire world had not just been quietly, publicly dismantled over the second course. Clara sat frozen through the remainder of the meal, barely tasting the food she could not bring herself to eat, aware of Lily's small hand creeping into hers beneath the table and gripping tightly, as though the child already sensed, with an instinct sharper than any adult at that table possessed, that something precious was slipping away. When the meal finally ended and the guests rose to move toward the drawing room, Clara excused herself as quickly as propriety allowed, murmuring something about seeing Lily to bed. She did not trust herself to remain in that room a moment longer without her composure shattering entirely. She got Lily settled, or tried to, though the girl clung to her with unusual desperation, sensing far more than a child her age should have to sense. Clara sang to her, read to her, stayed long past the usual hour, and only left once Lily had finally, reluctantly, fallen asleep. Then Clara returned to her own small room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the dark, and allowed herself, finally, to cry. She did not hear the soft knock at her door until it came a second time. Mrs. Fenwick stood in the corridor when Clara opened it, her expression unusually gentle, a folded note in her weathered hand. "From His Grace," the housekeeper said quietly, not quite meeting Clara's eyes. "He asks that you make arrangements to leave Ashford Hall tonight. A carriage will be ready within the hour." Clara took the note with trembling fingers. She did not need to open it to understand what it contained. The dinner had been the final blow, but this quiet, formal dismissal delivered through a housekeeper in the dead of night, was somehow worse. A confirmation that whatever she had believed was growing between herself and Edmund Ashford had never been strong enough to survive his aunt's disapproval or his own fear. "Tonight," Clara repeated numbly. "I'm sorry, dear," Mrs. Fenwick said, and for once her voice held no trace of its usual sternness. "Truly, I am. This house was better with you in it. But His Grace has made his decision, and it isn't my place, nor yours, to question it." Clara packed her few belongings with shaking hands, moving through the motions like someone caught in a nightmare they could not wake from. She thought of leaving a note for Lily, some small explanation, some promise that this was not the girl's fault, but she could not find words that would not break the child's heart even further, and in the end, she left nothing at all, unable to bear the thought of a goodbye that felt too final to write down. The carriage was waiting in the drive when she came down the back stairs, her single bag clutched against her chest, her eyes swollen from crying she had tried and failed to hide. She did not look back at the house as she climbed inside. She could not bear to. She did not know that high above the drive, in the nursery window, a small face had already pressed against the cold glass, woken by some instinct too large for a child to name, watching with growing horror as Clara's carriage pulled away into the dark, carrying away the only person in that great house who had ever truly seen her. Lily Ashford came awake all at once, the way children sometimes do when something inside them senses danger before their mind has fully caught up. The nursery was dark, except for the thin silver light of the moon spilling through the window, and for a moment she lay still, listening, trying to understand what had pulled her from sleep. Then she heard it again, faint but unmistakable, the crunch of carriage wheels on gravel below. She slipped out of bed and padded barefoot to the window, pressing her small hands and face against the cold glass, and what she saw below made her heart seize with a fear too large for her chest to hold. Clara was climbing into a carriage. Clara, with her single worn bag clutched against her, her shoulders shaking even from this distance, being helped up by a footman who would not quite meet her eyes. "No," Lily whispered, the word fogging the glass in front of her face. "No, no, no." She did not stop to find her shoes. She did not stop to find a shawl against the cold night air. She ran from the nursery in her thin nightgown, her bare feet slapping against the stone floors of the corridor, past the closed door of her father's study, where a thin line of candlelight still glowed beneath the frame, down the grand staircase 2 steps at a time, her small hand barely reaching the banister for balance. "Clara!" she screamed, the sound tearing out of her raw and desperate, echoing off the high ceilings of the entrance hall. "Clara, wait!" She burst through the front doors just as the carriage began to roll forward, and she ran after it across the gravel drive, with everything her small legs could give, her nightgown catching against her ankles, stones biting into her bare feet, tears streaming down her face and freezing in the cold night air. "Don't go. Please don't go. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good. Please don't leave me too." Inside the carriage, Clara heard the screaming before she understood what it was. Her whole body went rigid with recognition, and she twisted around in her seat, pressing her face to the small back window, and what she saw shattered whatever composure she had managed to hold together through the long walk from her room to the drive. Lily was running after the carriage in her bare feet, in nothing but her nightgown, her small arms outstretched, her face contorted with a grief no 6-year-old should ever have to feel. "Stop the carriage," Clara said, her voice cracking. When the driver did not immediately respond, lost in his own thoughts, she said it again, louder, pounding her fist against the carriage wall. "Stop. Stop this instant. Please, stop." The carriage lurched to a halt, and Clara was out the door and down onto the gravel before it had fully stopped moving, running back toward the small figure stumbling toward her in the dark. Lily collided with her at full speed, small arms wrapping around Clara's waist with a desperate strength that nearly knocked them both to the ground, and the sound that came out of the child then was not quite crying and not quite screaming, but something raw and wordless in between, a sound of pure animal grief that broke something loose in Clara's own chest. "I'm here," Clara said, sinking to her knees on the cold gravel, gathering Lily against her, feeling the girl's small body shaking violently, her bare feet like ice against Clara's hands. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." "You can't go," Lily sobbed into her shoulder, her whole body heaving. "You can't leave like Mama left. You promised you would never go." The words cut through Clara like a blade, because she remembered making that promise, on a rainy afternoon over a box of old ribbons, meaning every word of it with her whole heart, never once imagining that circumstances beyond her own will might force her to break it anyway. "I didn't want to go," Clara said, her own voice breaking now, tears falling freely as she held the shaking child against her. "I never wanted to leave you. Please believe that." "Then don't," Lily begged, pulling back just enough to look up at Clara with swollen, desperate eyes. "Please don't. I'll ask Papa. I'll make him understand. Please, Clara. Please don't go." Behind them, footsteps were approaching across the gravel, quick and urgent, and Clara looked up to see the Duke himself running from the house, still in his dinner clothes, his composure completely abandoned, his face white with a fear Clara had never before seen him wear. He had heard his daughter's screams from his study. He had thrown open the door and run without thinking, without his coat, without any thought for propriety or appearance, driven by a terror more powerful than any social embarrassment could ever be. He reached them and dropped to his knees on the cold gravel beside Clara, gathering his shaking daughter into his arms, his hands trembling as he felt how cold her bare feet had become, how violently her small body shook with sobs. "Lily," he said, his voice raw. "Lily, my darling, you'll catch your death out here. Come inside, please. Come inside where it's warm." "Not without Clara," Lily said fiercely, refusing to release her grip on Clara's dress, even as her father tried to gather her up. "I won't go anywhere without Clara. You can't make me. You can't make her leave, Papa. You can't. You can't." The Duke looked, over his daughter's shaking shoulders, directly at Clara, and in the moonlight, Clara saw something in his gray eyes that she had never seen there before. Not the cold formality of the dinner table, not the guarded distance of their early weeks together, but something raw and unguarded, and utterly undone. A man watching the full weight of his own mistake crash down upon him all at once. "Please," he said quietly, and Clara was not entirely certain in that moment whether he was speaking to his daughter or to her. "Please, come inside, both of you, just for tonight. We can discuss everything in the morning, when cooler heads prevail. But please, not out here in the cold, not like this." Clara looked down at Lily, still clinging to her with desperate strength, her small body shaking from cold and grief in equal measure, and she knew she could not, in good conscience, refuse to help settle the child, whatever her own broken heart might be feeling. "For Lily," Clara said quietly, meeting the Duke's eyes over his daughter's head. "I will stay tonight. For Lily's sake, and no other reason." Something crossed his face at those words, something that might have been relief, or might have been pain, or perhaps both tangled together beyond separating, but he only nodded, and together the three of them rose from the cold gravel and made their way back toward the house, Lily held tightly between them, refusing to release her grip on either of their hands. Inside, the remaining dinner guests had gathered in the entrance hall, drawn by the commotion, their faces a mixture of shock and poorly concealed curiosity. Lady Margaret stood among them, her expression tight with fury at the scene unfolding in front of her carefully orchestrated evening, and Miss Whitby stood slightly apart, her pretty face unreadable, watching the Duke carry his sobbing daughter past the assembled guests without so much as a glance in her direction. "Edmund," Lady Margaret hissed as he passed, "what is the meaning of this display? Our guests may see themselves out," the Duke said, without breaking stride, without so much as looking at his aunt, his voice carrying a hard edge Clara had never heard him use before. "I find I have far more urgent matters to attend to tonight than the comfort of dinner guests." The shock on Lady Margaret's face would have been almost satisfying, under different circumstances, but Clara had no room left in her exhausted heart for satisfaction. She followed the Duke up the stairs, Lily's small hand still gripping hers tightly, and together they carried the child back to the nursery, where Clara helped wrap her in warm blankets while a maid was sent running for hot water and dry clothes. It took nearly an hour before Lily's sobs finally quieted into exhausted hiccups, and longer still before her small body finally relaxed into the heavy, boneless sleep of a child who had cried herself past the point of consciousness. Clara sat beside the bed the entire time, holding one of Lily's hands, while the Duke sat in the chair on the opposite side, holding the other, neither of them speaking, both of them, watching the rise and fall of the small chest between them, as though it were the only thing anchoring them to the room. When Lily's breathing had finally settled into the deep, even rhythm of true sleep, Clara gently withdrew her hand and rose from the bedside, intending to retreat to her own room before anything further could be said between them, before her own composure, already stretched to breaking, could shatter entirely in front of the man who had caused this whole terrible night. But the Duke rose as well, and he did not let her pass without speaking. "Miss Whitfield," he said quietly, his voice hoarse, "Clara, please, I owe you an explanation, and an apology far greater than I know how to give." Clara stopped in the doorway, her back still to him, her hand resting on the frame for support. "It is very late, Your Grace. Perhaps this can wait until morning." "I don't think it can," he said, and something in his voice made her turn around despite herself, despite every instinct telling her to flee before her heart could be broken any further than it already had been that night. "I don't think I can bear to let another hour pass without telling you the truth of what happened at that table tonight, and why." Clara stood very still in the doorway, torn between the desperate hope she had been trying all evening to smother, and the hard-won caution of a woman who had already been hurt once that night by trusting too easily in the softness she thought she had seen in a guarded man's eyes. "Then speak plainly," she said finally. "I have had enough of careful words tonight to last me a lifetime." He nodded, and in the dim candlelight of the nursery, with his sleeping daughter breathing softly between them, Edmund Ashford began, at last, to tell her the truth. "I was a coward," the Duke said, and the words seemed to cost him something enormous, as though he had never once spoken it aloud in his life. "There is no gentler way to say it, and I will not insult you by trying to find one." Clara said nothing, waiting, her arms crossed protectively over her chest, as though she could shield herself from whatever came next. "When my wife died," he continued, his voice low and rough, "I made myself a promise that I would never again allow myself to feel anything so large that its loss could destroy me. I threw myself into managing the estate. I kept my distance from Lily, though God knows she needed her father more than ever, because every time I looked at her, I saw her mother's eyes looking back at me, and I could not bear it." He moved to stand beside the cold hearth, his back to Clara, his shoulders tight beneath his fine coat. "Then you arrived," he said, "and within weeks, my daughter was laughing again. Within weeks, this house began to feel like a home instead of a mausoleum, and I found myself, against every promise I had made to my own broken heart, beginning to feel things I had sworn I would never feel again." Clara's breath caught, but she said nothing, letting him continue, needing to hear the whole of it before she could allow herself to hope. "When my aunt arrived with her plans for Miss Whitby," he said, turning finally to face her. I told myself it was for the best. A proper match, a suitable duchess, a mother of appropriate standing for Lily. I told myself that what I felt toward you was nothing more than gratitude, easily managed, easily set aside in favor of duty. And tonight, Clara said quietly, when your aunt made her accusations at the table. Tonight I was a coward, he said again, more firmly this time. I saw the easiest path in front of me, the path that required nothing of me but silence, and I took it, because it was easier to hurt you than to risk losing everything all over again by admitting what I actually felt. I told myself I was protecting my family's name. In truth, I was protecting myself, at your expense, and I am more ashamed of it than I have been of anything in my life. Clara felt tears rising again, though these were different from the ones she had cried in the carriage. Not the tears of grief, but something more complicated, hope tangled together with hurt, still too fresh to fully release. You humiliated me, she said, her voice unsteady but clear. In front of a room full of strangers, you let your aunt say those things about me, about my character, and you said nothing to defend me. And then you sent me away in the middle of the night, without even the courtesy of a word spoken to my face. I know, he said, and his voice broke slightly on the words. I know, and I have no defense for it beyond the truth of my own fear. But Clara, when I heard Lily screaming, when I saw her running after your carriage in the dark with nothing on her feet. He stopped, pressing a hand briefly to his eyes, visibly shaken by the memory. I have never in my life been so afraid. Not even the night my wife died did I feel fear like that, because in that moment I understood, with perfect and terrible clarity, exactly what I had been about to throw away. Clara wrapped her arms more tightly around herself, uncertain what to say, uncertain whether she could trust the words being offered to her now, so soon after the wound they were meant to heal. I cannot simply forget what happened tonight because you have found new words to explain it, she said finally. Lily is asleep in that bed because she believed, with her whole heart, that she was losing someone else she loved. That fear does not disappear because her father has had a change of heart after the fact. I know that too, the Duke said quietly. I am not asking you to forget, or to forgive me, simply because I have finally found the courage to speak honestly. I am only asking for the chance to prove, through my actions rather than my words, that tonight was a mistake I intend to spend the rest of my life correcting. Clara studied his face in the candlelight, searching for some sign of insincerity, some hint that his change of heart was merely the product of a frightening night, rather than something deeper and more lasting. She found none, only the same raw honesty that had been in his voice from the moment he began speaking. But honesty alone, she knew, was not the same as reliability, and her heart had already been broken once this evening by trusting too quickly. I will stay, she said finally, for Lily's sake, until she has had time to recover from tonight. But I will not pretend that everything between us can simply return to what it was before dinner. Trust, once broken, must be rebuilt slowly, Your Grace. And I am not certain it can be rebuilt at all while your aunt remains in this house, shaping every decision you make. Then she will leave, he said, without hesitation, the decision settling into his voice with a firmness Clara had not heard from him before. Tomorrow, if necessary. This is my house, and my daughter, and I have allowed my aunt's opinions to govern both for far too long. That ends now. Clara felt a small, cautious flicker of something like hope beginning to stir beneath her exhaustion and hurt, though she was careful not to let it grow too quickly. And Miss Whitby? She asked. There was never anything between us beyond my aunt's ambitions, the Duke said. Miss Whitby herself seemed relieved, if anything, when I excused myself from the drawing room tonight. I do not believe her heart was any more engaged in this arrangement than mine was. They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound in the room Lily's soft, even breathing from the bed between them, and Clara felt the weight of the entire terrible evening finally beginning to settle into something she could examine more carefully, now that the immediate crisis had passed. Get some rest, Your Grace, she said finally, moving toward the door once more. We can speak further of all this in the morning, when we have both had time to think more clearly. Edmund, he said softly, as she reached the doorway. Please, after everything tonight, I would like it very much if you called me Edmund. Clara paused, her hand on the doorframe, and after a long moment, she allowed herself a small, tired smile. Good night, Edmund. She did not see the way his whole face changed at the sound of his own name in her voice, the tension leaving his shoulders for the first time all evening. But she felt, somehow, that something important had shifted between them in that small exchange, even if the larger questions still hanging over their future remained entirely unresolved. The following days brought changes to Ashford Hall that the servants would speak of for months afterward. Lady Margaret departed within 2 days of the disastrous dinner, her fury at being dismissed from her own carefully laid plans evident in every sharp word she flung at her nephew before her carriage finally pulled away down the long drive. Miss Whitby departed even sooner, with what Clara privately suspected was genuine relief, offering Clara a small, knowing smile on her way out the door that suggested the young woman had understood the true situation far better than Lady Margaret ever had. The Duke, meanwhile, seemed determined to prove his sincerity through exactly the kind of sustained action he had promised. He joined Story Hour every single evening without fail, no longer standing hesitantly in the doorway, but sitting fully beside his daughter, his voice growing more confident each time he took a turn reading aloud. He sought Clara out during the day, not with the careful, guarded distance of their early acquaintance, but with an openness that still occasionally seemed to surprise even himself, as though he were relearning, piece by piece, how to let another person matter to him. He asked her opinion on estate matters that had nothing to do with Lily, treating her thoughts with a respect Clara had rarely been offered by anyone, let alone a man of his standing. He remembered small details of conversations they had had weeks before and brought them up again, unprompted, showing a level of attention that told Clara he had been listening far more carefully, all along, than she had allowed herself to believe. And slowly, cautiously, Clara found her own guarded heart beginning to soften once more, though she remained careful not to let it soften too quickly. She had been hurt badly enough by one dinner and one moment of cowardice that she was not prepared to hand her trust back over, without evidence that the change she was witnessing was more than a temporary reaction to fear. It was Lily, in the end, who offered the clearest evidence of all. "Papa is different now," the little girl announced one afternoon, as she and Clara sat together in the garden beneath the old oak tree, the same tree where Clara and Edmund had once had their first honest conversation. "He smiles more, and he doesn't go quiet and sad in the evenings anymore, not like he used to." "Is that so?" Clara said carefully, keeping her eyes on the lesson book in her lap. "It's because of you," Lily said, with the simple certainty of a child who has never learned to doubt an obvious truth. "You made him better, Clara, same as you made me better. I think you should stay with us forever." Clara had not trusted herself to answer that, though the words settled somewhere deep in her chest and stayed there, warm and persistent, long after the conversation had moved on to other things. She did not yet know how soon she would be given the chance to answer Lily's wish in full, or how completely her careful, guarded heart was about to be won over at last, not by grand declarations across a dinner table, but by the quiet, steady accumulation of small kindnesses offered day after day by a man finally brave enough to let himself be seen. The invitation arrived at Ashford Hall exactly 1 month after the night Lily had run barefoot into the cold, and it named, in careful formal script, a dinner, to be held in honor of Miss Clara Whitfield. Clara stared at the card for a long moment after Simmons delivered it to her small sitting room, uncertain she had read it correctly. It was addressed not to Miss Whitfield the companion, tucked away in some corner of the guest list, but to Miss Whitfield as the guest of honor, with the Duke's own seal pressed into the wax beneath his signature. She found him in his study that evening, the same room where, weeks before, he had signed the note dismissing her from his house in the dead of night. He looked up when she entered, and something in his face told her he had been waiting, perhaps a little nervously, for exactly this conversation. "You cannot possibly mean this," Clara said, holding up the invitation. "A dinner in my honor. Edmund, the same neighbors who watched your aunt humiliate me at that table, will be sitting at this one." "Yes," he said simply. "They will. And this time, they will watch me correct the wrong I allowed to happen in that room, publicly and completely, so that no one in this county can ever again whisper that Clara Whitfield was sent from this house in shame." Clara's throat tightened. "And what, exactly, do you intend to say to them?" He rose from behind his desk and crossed the room to stand before her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw no trace of the guarded, distant man who had once passed through his own halls like a shadow. What stood before her now was simply a man, uncertain but determined, holding his heart out plainly for her to see. "I intend to tell them the truth," he said, "that the woman they watched me dismiss is the same woman who taught my daughter to laugh again, who taught me to remember how to feel something other than fear, and who I hope, if she will have me, will agree to become the next Duchess of Ashford." Clara felt the room tilt slightly beneath her feet. "Edmund, I know I have no right to ask this so soon," he said quickly, before she could refuse him outright. "I know the wound I caused you is still healing, but I have spent the past month proving, I hope, that the man who failed you at that dinner table is not the man I intend to be for the rest of my life. I love you, Clara. I think some part of me has loved you since the first evening Lily asked me to sit beside her, and I have wasted enough time being afraid of what that love might cost me. I would rather risk everything and have you beside me than protect myself from loss by living the rest of my life without you in it." Clara stood very still, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it, and she thought of everything the past month had shown her. The steady, patient way he had rebuilt her trust, the quiet dismissal of his aunt's ambitions, the countless small kindnesses offered without any expectation of reward, the way his daughter now ran to greet them both each morning with equal, unguarded joy. "Ask me properly then," she said finally, her voice trembling with something that was no longer fear, not with an invitation card and a study door closed against the world. "Ask me where everyone who watched you fail me can also watch you make it right." A slow smile spread across his face, the first truly unguarded smile Clara had ever seen him wear. "At the dinner, then." "At the dinner," Clara agreed. The evening of the dinner arrived cold and clear, the great hall once again filled with candlelight and polished silver. The same neighbors who had witnessed Clara's humiliation gathered once more around the long table. This time, however, Clara did not sit at the far end among the least distinguished guests. She sat at the Duke's right hand, in a gown he had insisted on providing for the occasion, her chin held high despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Lily sat on her other side, practically vibrating with excitement, having been let in on the secret earlier that afternoon and sworn, with great difficulty, to silence. The meal proceeded through its courses much as the disastrous dinner had weeks before, but the atmosphere in the room was entirely different. Where once there had been cold formality and cutting insinuation, now there was warmth, curiosity, the palpable sense among the assembled guests that something significant was about to unfold. It was the Duke himself who rose when the final course had been cleared, tapping his glass gently to draw the room's attention, and Clara felt her heart climb into her throat as every eye at the table turned toward him. "Some of you were present at this table 1 month ago," he began, his voice steady despite the visible nervousness beneath it. "On an evening I am not proud of, I allowed a good and honest woman to be humiliated in this very room, and I compounded that wrong by sending her away in cowardice rather than defending her as I should have. Tonight, I intend to correct that wrong, fully and publicly, before all of you." He turned to face Clara directly, and the room fell into complete silence. "Clara Whitfield," he said, "you arrived at this house a stranger, and became, within months, the very heart of it. You brought my daughter back to life with your patience and your kindness. You taught me, through your example, what it means to face grief honestly, rather than hide from it behind cold formality. I was a fool to ever let fear convince me to push you away, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you never again doubt your place in this house, or in my heart." He lowered himself to one knee before the assembled guests, and a soft gasp moved around the table, though Clara heard none of it, her entire attention fixed on the man kneeling before her, with such open, unguarded hope in his gray eyes. "Will you do me the honor," he said, "of becoming my wife, and Lily's mother in truth as well as in every way that has already mattered these past months?" Clara looked past him, briefly, to where Lily sat with both hands pressed over her mouth, her eyes shining with tears of pure joy, practically bouncing in her seat with the effort of staying silent, as she had promised. "Yes," Clara said, her own voice breaking with happiness she no longer had any reason to guard against. "Yes, Edmund, I will." The dining hall erupted into applause and delighted exclamations, and Lily could contain herself no longer, launching out of her chair and throwing her arms around both Clara and her father at once, laughing and crying in equal measure. repeating the word yes over and over, as though she could not say it enough times to fully capture her joy. In the weeks that followed, the wedding was arranged with a speed that scandalized precisely no one who had witnessed the depth of feeling on display at that dinner table. Clara Whitfield became Clara Ashford in a small, warm ceremony, attended by the household staff, who had watched her transform their home from the very beginning, by neighbors who had come to admire the quiet strength she had shown throughout her ordeal, and by one small flower girl who insisted, with great seriousness, on scattering rose petals not toward the altar but directly at her father's feet, declaring that he needed all the extra luck he could get after taking so long to figure out what everyone else in the house had known for months. Mrs. Fenwick wept openly during the ceremony, insisting afterward that it was simply dust in her eyes. Old Simmons allowed himself a rare, full smile as he watched the new Duchess walk past him on her husband's arm. And somewhere in the crowd, a letter arrived from Lady Margaret weeks later, stiff and formal, offering something that might have been intended as an apology, though Clara chose not to examine it too closely, content instead to let the past remain in the past where it belonged. That evening, after the wedding guests had finally departed and the great house had settled into quiet, Clara found herself once again in the nursery, this time not as a hired companion, but as Lily's mother, tucking the little girl into bed while Edmund stood in the doorway, watching with an expression of pure, unguarded contentment that Clara knew she would treasure for the rest of her life. "Will you stay forever now?" Lily asked sleepily, as Clara smoothed the blankets around her. "Forever," Clara promised, and this time, she knew with absolute certainty, it was a promise she would never have to break. She rose from the bedside and crossed to where Edmund waited, and together they stood watching their daughter drift off to sleep, the same small wooden horse that had first opened Lily's heart resting safely in her arms, a quiet reminder of everything that had been lost, and everything, against all odds, that had finally been found again. 6 months into the marriage, a letter arrived that threatened to unsettle the peace Clara had worked so hard to build. It came from Mr. Harold Prescott, the family's longtime lawyer, requesting an urgent meeting regarding a clause in the late Duchess's will that no one at Ashford Hall had thought to examine closely in years. Edmund's face turned pale as he read the letter over breakfast, and Clara felt her stomach tighten with a familiar, unwelcome dread. Harold arrived 2 days later, a thin, careful man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and a leather case full of documents under his arm. He was shown into the study, where Clara insisted on being present despite Edmund's initial hesitation to involve her in matters of estate law. "It concerns Lily's guardianship," Harold explained, spreading old papers across the desk. "Your late wife, in her final months, added a provision stating that should you remarry, any new wife would need to be formally approved by the family court as a fit guardian before full parental rights could be transferred. It was, I believe, meant to protect Lily from the possibility of a hasty or unsuitable match, should the worst happen and you were left to raise her alone. And now," Edmund said grimly, "someone has decided to invoke this clause." Harold's expression confirmed it before he spoke. "Lady Margaret has filed a formal petition questioning Clara's suitability. She cites her lack of noble birth, her previous financial circumstances, and, I am sorry to say, the unconventional beginning of your courtship as grounds for concern." Clara felt the old fear rising in her chest, sharp and familiar, the sense of being judged and found wanting by people who had never once bothered to know her heart. But this time, she noticed, the fear did not paralyze her the way it once might have. She had faced a room full of judgment before, and survived it. She could survive this too. "Then we will answer the petition," Clara said firmly. "With evidence, not fear. Lily's happiness speaks for itself, and any court willing to actually observe this family will see that clearly enough." The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, held in a modest courtroom in the nearest town, before a magistrate known for his careful, unhurried judgment. Lady Margaret arrived with her own barrister, and a stack of prepared arguments, clearly intending to make quick work of what she considered an obvious case. She had not counted on Lily. The magistrate, wishing to understand the child's own perspective before ruling, asked gently whether Lily would like to speak about her home life. Lady Margaret's barrister objected, suggesting the child was too young to offer meaningful testimony, but the magistrate overruled him, noting that no one understood a household better than the child living inside it. Lily, dressed in her best blue frock and holding tightly to the small wooden horse she carried everywhere now, stood before the magistrate with a composure that surprised everyone in the room except her parents. "Before Clara came," Lily said, her clear voice carrying through the quiet courtroom, "I didn't talk very much. I was sad all the time, and I didn't like anyone, and I didn't eat unless someone put food right in front of me. Everyone thought something was wrong with me, but nothing was wrong with me. I just missed my mother, and no one had waited long enough to let me be sad before they wanted me to be happy again." She paused, looking briefly toward Clara before continuing. "Clara waited," she said simply. "She didn't try to make me talk before I was ready. She gave me my mother's horse and let me cry, and she stayed with me even when I was quiet for a long time. She taught me to read, and she taught Papa to smile again too. I don't care that she wasn't born a lady. She's the best mother I could ever have, and if the court makes her go away, I don't think I'll ever be happy again." The courtroom fell utterly silent. Even Lady Margaret's barrister seemed uncertain how to follow such testimony with legal argument, and Lady Margaret herself, Clara noticed with some surprise, had gone very still, her usual sharp confidence faltering for the first time since Clara had known her. The magistrate called a brief recess, and when the hearing resumed, he did not take long to render his decision. "I have heard a great deal of testimony today regarding birth, and standing, and the propriety of courtships," he said. "But the purpose of the clause in question was never to protect a title. It was to protect a child, and I have rarely, in all my years on this bench, heard a child speak so clearly and so convincingly about her own well-being as young Lady Lily Ashford has spoken today. The petition is denied. Full guardianship rights are confirmed for Clara Ashford, Duchess of Ashford, effective immediately." The relief that swept through Clara was so profound she nearly wept right there in the courtroom, saved only by Lily's small arms wrapping around her waist in a triumphant hug, and by Edmund's steady hand finding hers, gripping tightly, his own eyes bright with unshed tears of relief and pride. Lady Margaret did not linger after the ruling. She gathered her things and departed the courtroom without a word to any of them. And though Clara felt no particular satisfaction in her defeat, she felt, for the first time since arriving at Ashford Hall so many months ago, that she finally, truly, completely belonged. The ride home was quiet and warm. Lily curled between her parents, exhausted, but glowing with the particular pride of a child who has just discovered the power of her own honest voice. Edmund kept glancing over at Clara throughout the journey, his expression full of a tenderness that still, even now, occasionally caught her off guard. "You did not need to defend me quite so thoroughly," Clara said softly, catching his gaze. "I would have found my own way to convince the magistrate eventually." "I know," Edmund said, "but I have spent enough of my life staying silent when I should have spoken. I intend to spend the rest of it making certain you never again have to wonder whether I will stand beside you when it matters." Clara smiled and rested her head against his shoulder as the carriage rolled steadily toward home, the countryside passing peacefully outside the window. No storm gathering on the horizon this time, only the quiet promise of ordinary happiness stretching out ahead of them. That evening, once Lily had finally been coaxed into bed after recounting her courtroom triumph to every servant in the house at least twice, Clara and Edmund walked together beneath the old oak tree in the garden, the same tree where their honest conversation had first begun so many months before. "Do you remember what you told me here?" Edmund asked, "about grief needing to be walked through rather than rushed?" "I remember," Clara said. "I think the same must be true of trust," he said, taking her hand in his beneath the darkening sky. "It cannot be rushed either. It must be walked through, slowly, one honest day at a time. I am grateful, more than I know how to say, that you were willing to walk that path with me, even after I gave you every reason to walk away instead." Clara looked up at him, at the man who had once been a shadow moving silently through his own halls, now standing beside her fully present, fully hers, and she thought of the long road that had brought them here, the silent child who had learned to laugh again, the cold dinner table that had nearly ended everything, the desperate cry of a little girl running barefoot into the dark, and the slow, steady rebuilding of trust that had followed. "I would walk it again," she said quietly. "Every step, even the hardest ones, if it meant arriving here, in this garden, with the both of you." Above them, the stars had begun to appear over Ashford Hall, And somewhere inside the great stone house, a little girl slept peacefully in her bed, no longer waiting by any window for someone who would never return, because at last, everyone she loved most in the world was exactly where they belonged.